Relatively conservative American philosopher Eric Hoffer once wrote that what starts out in the US as a mass movement ends up as a racket, a cult, or a corporation. This remark was then repackaged on the internet to sound better and also further remove it from its American context, to the point that the repackaging is quoted far more often than the original, and almost always for the purposes of demoralization. Still, this is an innocuous example of snake oil dooming, because it keeps the original intent and still allows the reader to agree or disagree. Unfortunately, most other examples are nowhere near that innocent. Snake oil dooming has been with us for a long time. The only thing that changed recently is the speed with which it can be broadcasted and the far easier access to the most susceptible population. What is snake oil dooming, how to spot it, and how to keep your mental sanity when you're flooded with it? That's the topic. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, as much as I really like the term snake oil dooming for its ability to avoid triggering puritanical algorithms, this video is really about panic porn. So I will use these two terms, snake oil dooming and panic porn, interchangeably. I can do that since nobody has done any substantial research that is also rigorous. In fact, most of the body of research on this is so brazenly partisan that it could itself be considered panic porn. Now, I'll try not to do that here. So, as usual, the talk is divided as follows. 1. Brief history. 2. The difference between snake oil dooming and call to action type of propaganda. They do have some similarities, and I've seen people routinely confuse them, and routinely that confusion is intentional. 3. How to recognize it. 4. Examples. 5. How to address it individually. 6. How to combat it. And finally, number 7, some conclusions. Alright then, let's roll. Chapter 1. Brief history. Now, the modern notion of panic porn is routinely defined with a presentist bias. That is to say, the most oft-cited definitions simply assume that this is a new phenomenon. We've been seeing a lot of this since the onset of the pandemic project and all the way till present day. Just a few weeks ago, it was still fashionable to say that people voting for Alternative für Deutschland, they do so because TikTok told them to. More widely, panic porn is used to describe content that deliberately amplifies fear, anxiety, or urgency to hook an audience. It's not about informing so much as it is about emotional manipulation, often exaggerating the threats or worst-case scenarios to keep people scrolling, clicking, or watching. But if we remove the discussion about scrolling and clicking, we suddenly realize that this isn't new. For instance, Protocols of the Elders of Zion is probably the most well-known example of panic porn, and ironically, this is the case because it's been rehashed the most. And if that sounds very similar to the viral thread slop that you can see on social media, it's because the mechanism never changed. The way a piece of panic porn ends up widely shared has been unchanged for centuries. And the recipe is like this. Take a few real things, give it a better spin, add some outrageous lies that are very difficult to check for most people, and then release it. Assess the success and then adapt depending on the audience's response. This is how the piece of Russian literature Black Propaganda worked. In fact, it wasn't even initially called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but Programa Zavoyevania Mira Евреями, the World Conquest Program of the Jews. That title was originally not particularly attractive. It wasn't clickbaity enough, as we would say in contemporaneity. And that remained true for several years, even if anti-Jewish sentiment was very popular in Russia in the first and second decade of the 20th century. It reached more popularity when it was translated into French and German, and during the translation process, the title was changed and a few more things were added, particularly some rephrasings from the 1873 book The Conquest of the World by the Jews by Osman Bey, a British Ottoman author who, after completing military service in the Caliphate, failed to achieve much success as an author in the Muslim world, so he tried his luck as a conspiracist in the West. Now, that worked out very well for him personally, but even more important, his ideas ended up improving panic porn written years after his death. This whole process that I just described is no different from the process of panic porn today on social media. It's just that today it's slightly faster. Threads are merged and multiple versions of the same thing are disseminated, and then, following an impact analysis, the one with the most impressions overall or with the most impressions on the target audience is kept, while all other previous versions are memory hold. After all, very few remember Osman Bey. Even professional anti-Semites will likely not know off the top of their head who Osman Bey was. Beyond black propaganda used for various political purposes, there are plenty of tragic examples of panic porn in history that did not intend to do any form of harm, but nevertheless ended up doing just that. For instance, after World War II, Japan's food supply was shaky and cheap candies flooded the market. In 1955, rumors spread that these sweets, often made by small, unregulated vendors, were laced with arsenic or some other toxin. A few kids got sick, some from unrelated causes, and suddenly parents were torching candy stashes. Newspapers ran lurid stories of death by confection, and the government launched massive inspections. Actual poisonings turned out to be very, very rare, and of the illnesses discovered, most traced back to other causes such as poor sanitation, but not malice from vendors. But the fear crippled all of those small businesses and left several generations paranoid about candy. Now, paranoia about candy is not the worst thing, but imagine how it felt to the small business owners suddenly finding their whole wealth torched over something that wasn't even their fault. Because many of the victims of this panic weren't even making or selling candy to begin with. That is to say, even if the initial claim had been true, the panic resulted wasn't addressing it. And if that sounds all too familiar to the pandemic project, it's because public health has always been like that. Illegitimate and a net harm to society. Which is precisely why the most successful examples of panic porn rely on so-called public health concerns. And incidentally, it's also why delegitimizing public health is such an important task for the moral progress of our civilization. But I digress. Another example that I really, really like is the Kishtum disaster panic. Precisely because it has been repeated more and more often in the last century. That's why I like it. The Kishtum disaster was real. A nuclear waste tank exploded near Kishtum in 1957 at the polonium processing plant in the closed city Chelyabinsk-Sorok in the Soviet Union. The explosion spread radiations across the Urals mountains. As customary in the Soviet Union, the government hushed it up, but rumors leaked. Villagers whispered of glowing skies, poisoned rivers, and mutant animals. How did the locals come up with these crazy ideas? Well, they mixed their own imagination with the official propaganda about what a nuclear explosion means. Both the Soviet Union and the United States at that time had decades-long public campaigns that aimed to scare the populace about how terrible a nuclear attack was. Our American friends may know it as duck and cover. Now, a nuclear explosion is bad, but what people were told about it was an intentional exaggeration and a plethora of largely useless advice. Anyway, long story short, without any credible information, fear festered in Chelyabinskaya Oblast and then spread too. The more time went on, the more the gossip stock market was coming up with even crazier claims. It was claimed that entire towns had vanished, while those with some military experience, but also drunk on Soviet propaganda, were firmly convinced that the whole event was an attack by the Americans. Now, mind you, That may sound funny today, but in 1957, the leadership of the Soviet Union was still quite unstable, so claims that the country was attacked by the Americans and the leadership says nothing were not just sedition, but had the potential to turn everything really, really hot. Just not nuclear, though. The state's silence let panic porn thrive, leading quite literally to exaggerated tales spreading faster than the radiation itself. Decades later, declassified records show that the disaster was indeed pretty bad, with several hundreds dying over time from radiation exposure. But most of the wildest stories, like two-headed cows roaming or entire towns vaporized, was pure folklore born from secrecy and fear. Now, there's plenty of other examples. Like, for instance, at least a third of the people who died during the 1989 Romanian Revolution did not die as a result of direct combat between Ceausescu loyalists and revolutionaries, but rather as a result of reckless actions of lone individuals driven by panic. But beyond the killing, lots of needless drama occurred as a result of panic porn as well. Some of it intentional, some of it as a result of feeble emotions. There is a sort of an artsy short film about this. It's called Stremts 89, and it's how the revolution was perceived in a godforsaken village in Transylvania. Now, I think I found a version that has a decent English subtitle. It's not on YouTube, but it's available for free, so I'll leave that in the description. It may not be fully comprehensible for those not versed in the local context, but what I'm aiming at is that during the revolution, the plebs were subjected to multiple versions of psyops, panic porn, and disinformation. A lot of it intentional, but some of it accidental as well. And to be fair, this continued many more years after the revolution, and it's the main reason why my fellow countrymen instinctively distrust the regime. But once again, I digress. Anyway, enough with history. Chapter 2. The difference between snake oil dooming and other types of propaganda. Now, of course, with this being social science, some of it is ultimately art, and in art, well, every two people have three opinions. So, for instance, in the example earlier with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that in itself can be classified as black propaganda as well. If you don't know what that is, see my 2018 video, What is Black Propaganda and How to Use It. Similarly, some examples of panic porn can easily be confused with call to action or some other similar type of agitation and propaganda. That's why I like the term snake oil dooming so much, because although a bit longer and harder to remember, it's also more clear. The easiest way to differentiate between panic porn from call to action and other forms of agitation is to look for the conclusion. If the conclusion is lacking or it leads to irrelevant actions, then you're probably dealing with panic porn. Same goes if the suggested action is something impossible, therefore meant to make you feel powerless. You see, this is very common, for instance, in green left propaganda, where the solution is almost always utopian socialism or straight-up impossible policies. Another way of distinguishing call to action from snake oil dooming is the use of passive voice and avoidance of naming the source of the problem, most often through the use of ambiguous they. If you're still unsure, just ask who's they, and if you get a squirm or a vague answer, then you know you're dealing not just with panic porn, but intentional panic porn as well. However, if there is a clear indication of who or what is the problem, then it's less likely that you're dealing with panic porn and more likely that you're dealing with classic activist propaganda. Mind you, it could still be a lie, but it's just not panic porn. Mind you, this again applies regardless of the ideological or political bent of that propaganda, or whether you agree with it or not. I'm not making a political point here, I'm making a technocratic one. And since more people than ever are susceptible to propaganda, understanding this technical difference is highly useful, quite frankly, for pretty much everyone. Well, I think I overlapped with the next chapter, so chapter 3, how to recognize panic porn. Well, in addition to excessive use of passive voice and lack of concrete answers to questions like who and for whom, panic porn also tends to be the form of propaganda that is most likely to avoid multivariate issues. Or, in less pompous terms, panic porn tries really hard to reduce everything in the mind of the listener down to a single cause, and even when there are dozens of other factors involved. Also, while most forms of viral propaganda include appeals to emotion, panic porn distinguishes itself through unconstrained negativity, mostly as a result of the fact that it has no immediate end. When you try to rile up people up to join a cause, you necessarily have to introduce something positive in the propaganda. But if the purpose is to get people to be afraid or demoralized, positivity is not only unnecessary, but it would defeat the purpose. This is true for historical examples too, but it's even more true for contemporary snake oil dooming. Think of endless doom-laden headlines about impending disasters, health crises, or societal collapse paired with ominous imagery and usually LLM-generated breathless commentary. Those are meant to trigger a sort of hardwired attraction to danger, let's put it this way, while drowning out, of course, a lot of nuance and possible answers or ways to address the problem, or even identify if there is a problem to begin with. Now, depending on the purpose, some forms of panic porn end up being a voyeuristic thrill, if you want. Basically, content in which fear itself becomes the entertainment itself. That's mostly for grift purposes. Ideological or political panic porn, on the other hand, tends to be darker because the purpose is to enrage you, but without providing an outlet for that rage. That's why I insist so much on the difference between panic porn and call to action type of propaganda. I mean, I should know, I wrote plenty of the latter. In fact, when I'm short on time or the client can't afford my premium services, the easiest way to write effective call to action propaganda is to fish for the most effective panic porn on the topic, dial down the crazy a notch or two, add one or two nuances, and triumphantly announce the action, be it a protest, a letter writing campaign, a lawsuit, or whatever. And although I did mention the avoidance of multivariance, there is one other distinct element in panic porn that is very rare in other types of propaganda: lack of context. Now, to be fair, this difference has become murkier in the age of short attention spans, which in itself is a worrisome development, but that's a story for another time. For the purposes of this talk, the lack of context is in itself a red flag. You see, this is primarily encountered in so-called public health snake oil dooming. A lot of public health messaging becomes self-evidently illegitimate once you ask the question, compared to what? Oh my goodness, this is a recent example. A child died from measles. This is an emergency, said the public health shills just a few days ago in the United States. Oh really? Is this an emergency? A child died. Okay, that's terrible. How bad is it? Compared to what? There's 100 to 120 baby boys who die every year during genital mutilation in the US. Public health could solve that in half a minute, but chooses not to. But 10 deaths in 40 years from what is known in the rest of the world as a standard childhood disease is now an emergency that warrants upending the norms of civil life? Give me a freaking break, will ya? And since I already gave an example, chapter 4, examples. Well, I could make this chapter an hour long, but it's probably better not to. So, almost every message from the pandemic project is a good example of panic porn. By the way, that includes most messaging from those purporting to oppose it as well. On the pro-pandemic project side, we had the panic porn about long COVID, and on the dissident side, we had the multiple choice in panic porn, from digital ID to weird and irrelevant fears. The effect of both of them was to prolong the panic project. I'm not saying all or even most of that was intentional, but there's no denying that this was the effect. The pandemic project lasted longer than it could have because of panic porn. Heck, my biggest hurdle at the time was not filing the lawsuits or dealing with NPC police officers and then subsequently making the lives of obedient bureaucrats purposefully harder for their role in the pandemic project. That was the easy part, and still is. As annoying and as autistic administrative warfare is, it's still easy. The hardest part was deprogramming enough people from their steady doses of panic porn into actually doing something, anything. The Pandemic Project had a lot of both intentional and unintentional panic porn that effectively wasted everyone's time, thus slowing down the backlash. And this still has effects to this day. There are very few Shelley Luthers out there. Heck, most don't even know even today that this was possible. Shelley Luther was jailed for keeping her salon open during the 2020 lockdown. Last month, she was seated in the Texas House of Representatives, elected on an explicit anti-public health platform. There are a few other examples in North America and Europe, but quite frankly, nowhere near enough. And part of the reason is, well, genetic. Most people are NPCs, as arrogant as that may sound. But part of the reason is also the prevalence of panic porn, which, among other things, convinced a huge number of people that there's not much they can do. Combine that with the time-wasting effect, and there's your results. If more people would spend more time studying how to acquire political power instead of studying about graphene and weird conspiracies, now that would have been great. Heck, it would still be great if more people would drop the study of panic porn today and start studying what matters. Other examples: artificial intelligence, automated trucks, nuclear war, acid rain, the ozone layer hole, remember that one? Soon it will be 10 years since I made the video "Work is Here to Stay." Almost 10 years ago, tech bros were pumping a lot of money into panic porn about how truck drivers should learn to code because their job will be replaced by automated trucks in 10 years. How's that working out? There are more truck drivers today than in 2016 in every single country in the world. Meanwhile, there are fewer tech bros and layoffs will continue until morale improves. Similarly, there is the de-dollarization panic porn. This one is state-sponsored, by the CCP, of course. I talked quite a bit about it in the 4th season of Propaganda Basement that is currently ongoing. I will eventually make a video unifying the whole topic, but still, that's panic porn. Meanwhile, a more fashionable form of panic porn these days is airplanes. If you poll people these days, they will believe airplane safety is worse than last year, especially in the United States. Why would they believe such nonsense? Well, because algorithmic enshittification combined with politically motivated media outlets has been incessantly reporting on every aviation incident for the past month or so. However, if we go on the Federal Aviation Administration's website, there's an archive there with every single aviation incident going back all the way to 1994. In June 2024, for instance, there were 56 aviatic incidents in the US, more than half of them crashes with casualties. But in June 2024, there was no political or financial incentive to report about them. What would you say? That Dementia Joe is at fault? However, in February 2025, there was an incentive. The looming audits and the absolutely necessary and laudable firings that Dodge has been doing in the federal government triggered the immune response from the enemy, in this case, the entrenched bureaucracy. I understand this surprises my American friends who, although have been living in Eastern Europe for decades, they never knew it until recently and most still don't know it, but this is standard. When you start to actually drain the swamp, the propaganda war is very dirty. And some of it is not even intentional. A lot of bureaucrats genuinely believe that the country literally collapses without their precious work. Needless to say, they're nearly always wrong, and ultimately nobody is irreplaceable. But while draining the swamp, one side effect that you should expect is this kind of panic porn. Now, I could give more examples, but I think I made the point, hopefully. So, Chapter 5, how to address it individually. Well, unfortunately, there is no easy way. That's why more and more forces, not just political, are resorting to it. Because it's cheap to create, cheap to distribute, and very hard to combat panic porn. To make things worse, it's human psychology and makes it cheap to distribute. You see, all you need is the first step distribution. After that, the influencers will take it up and pass it voluntarily, for free. In 1962, Jacques Ellul wrote Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitude, which, by the way, is a book that you absolutely should read, alongside The Technological Society from '54, from the same author. Mr. Ellul figured viral algorithmically enshittified distribution of propaganda in 1954, making him the last original author in the technique of propaganda. Anyway, Mr. Ellul wrote in 1962 that the people most susceptible to propaganda are those who interact with the largest volumes of information, the people who feel the need to give their opinions on virtually every topic. I mean, he was envisioning public intellectuals at his time, but this applies even better to terminally online content creators these days. And also more people most susceptible to propaganda would also be those who deem themselves competent to judge the quality of any information, regardless of measurable competence. On this latter one, I always lose social media brownie points because I reply with "I don't know" or "I don't care" far too often. To understand why you should do the same, check my 2017 video, The Virtue of Saying I Don't Know. So the first step to address panic porn on an individual level is to always be mindful of what makes most people susceptible to propaganda and try to avoid falling into those categories. As I was warning people during the pandemic project, please don't try to emulate people like me. People like me, genuine news junkies, are abnormal, maybe even defective. Most people can't process the news feeds as they exist today, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like most people can't be astronauts or be Elon Musk, for better or for worse. But if you think you're part of the exception, please, for the love of God, don't opine on everything under the sun, not even as an internal monologue. It's perfectly okay not to have an opinion on everything. The more boxes you tick in Ellul's description, the more likely it is that you'll be falling down the lane of panic porn. And I say this to both regular people and those who try to be influencers of any kind. Because again, what makes panic porn so prevalent is the fact that it's cheap. And what makes it cheap is the set of incentives. If you can get the correct panic porn in front of the correct influencers, they'll spread it for you for free. How do I know this? Because I write and distribute panic porn aimed at leftists at least on a monthly basis, usually more often. It's not nice, but it works. Several years of this, and the left is now so discombobulated in most targeted markets. A few more years of this, and hopefully we'll have an impotent left for a generation. Slava Bogu. But, maybe I should shut up about that, quite frankly. Anyway, you see, another reason why this works is precisely because nobody tells you how it works. If anything, I'm running against my interests by making this video. The second step towards addressing panic porn at the individual level is knowledge and wisdom, but especially wisdom. The more you know about the issue you're being targeted for panic, the less likely it is that you'll take the bait. Having a long memory also helps. Like for instance, the reason 0% of panic porn worked on me during the pandemic project was because I had already thoroughly studied the entire thing in 2009 at the previous attempt. All I had to do was increase the scale and that's it. And yeah, the details were a little bit different, but not by much. By and large, the pandemic project of 2020-22 was a bigger version of the project from 2009. But okay, not everyone can do this and not everyone has the time for this. What's easier is to remember to always take a deep breath and have a cigarette, no, I'm serious, and then start asking questions. Who? Under whose authority? And by that always inquire about a person, not some shadowy structure. Again, there is no such thing as they or the government. No. There's always a person or a group of persons with names, home addresses, and social security numbers. Personal relationships are what make the world go round. Always make it personal. And then, once you establish that, always inquire logistics. How is something going to happen? Very, very concretely. Concrete responses, please. Like for instance, the recurring panic porn about mass migration in Europe. Ever since the Dublin Doctrine became self-evidently untenable, every 6 months or so, a few countries of Europe get a wave of panic porn about how new migrants will be settled into their countries. Oftentimes, that panic porn is sponsored by Russia, but not always. Now, of course, in reality, it rarely materialized, and it's highly unlikely that it will materialize again, but that doesn't stop the panic porn, and with it, the mental damage that it does to people exposed to it. Why? Because most people don't ask the correct questions. Like, for instance, how exactly are you going to do that? Oh, okay, so you're saying that 100,000 migrants will be resettled into my country. Okay, how are you going to do that? And under whose authorities? These two questions demolish between 90 and 99% of the viral narratives about migration, both those who are in favor of it and those who are against it. Right? It's the same way panic porn on the left is, oh my goodness, the AfD will deport 3 million people. Really? How exactly are they going to do that? Under whose authority? See how this works? Because once you start looking into the logistics of it, it becomes clear that it's very difficult and routinely outright impossible, at least on a short term. The same process applies when you're dealing with someone who has fallen into a rabbit hole of panic porn. Just calmly ask him or her these questions. Who, under whose authority, and how? Never ask why, because that will trigger a conspiratorial response. Always insist on logistics and details that are not subjected to interpretation or opinion. Of course, if the answers are satisfactory, and sometimes they are, albeit rarely, then it's time for you to research the issue, because there might be something to it. But most of the time, the answers are not satisfactory, and you've just saved very precious time in your life by not entertaining panic porn. Time you can now use to touch grass. And now comes the part where I'm not making myself any new friends. Chapter 5. How to combat it more broadly. Short answer, you don't. Long answers, no, seriously, you don't. Looking at the record of history, panic porn is like any other epidemic, because it is ultimately a mind virus. You just have to contend with the fact that it will rip and wait it out. The good news is that even the best panic porn is not endless. At some point, it does die out. The bad news is that some forms of panic porn can be recurrent, like a real epidemic. And for those, there are a few ways to address it, but none very effective. The more naive among us will say that education will at least alleviate the problem, but I think the record of history is pretty damn clear that that's not exactly true. And the reason this German or Leninist assumption turned out to be mostly false about education is simple. Panic porn is not a feature of the uneducated or the stupid. Snake oil dooming hits people differently based on different factors, the level of education being just one of them. So even if you could create a magical universe in which everyone was educated, using whatever definition you want for the word educated, that won't make a single dent into all of the other factors. I mentioned earlier that public health-related panic porn is surprisingly common throughout history. The reason for that is because carefully crafted dooming will be highly effective if it targets fear of death. Now, fear of death is not linear, but it's present in nearly all humans to a certain degree, and no amount of education will change that. At best, better information and more wisdom may convince some people to attempt to switch it off when it becomes clear that it's not needed, but even that is no guarantee. One of the most consistent supporters of the SOFA since the pandemic project has been a person who thought COVID-19 was lethal to 20% of the populace. That person still believed that as late as 2023. But that person also agreed with me that even in that scenario, it is still entirely illegitimate for the state to act as it did, so that person funded some of my judicial activism attempts. Only in late 2023, when it became undeniable that I was right on the science as well, not just on liberty and legality, that person finally relaxed. These are real-life complexities that make it very difficult, and I would argue straight up impossible, to address the issue of snake oil dooming on a wider scale, beyond individual and immediate family or tribe. And this is precisely why all of the efforts about media literacy, or recently Orwellian projects like the one from the German Ministry of Internal Affairs, Democracy Lives, these projects have always failed and will continue to fail because they address something material when in reality the most successful panic porn aims at the limbic system, and this stands true for conspiratorial trains of thought as well. And this is an issue that has been with us for millennia. It's strongly documented for over 15 centuries. It's not a new issue at all, which is why I also laugh when I hear some of these new initiatives that assume panic porn started with TikTok or algorithmic enshittification more broadly. Sure, social media algorithms amplify, but they amplify what the audience already wants to hear most of the time. And again, snake oil dooming with terrible consequences has been successfully deployed countless of times before most people were even aware that electricity exists, let alone the internet. Now the good news, or the silver lining, is that you don't have to be a victim of this. And this is especially true in contemporaneity. Now, I always do get a lot of flack when I remind people that in 2025, stupidity is a choice. The same in shittified algorithms that feed you panic porn can also feed you wisdom. Just make better choices and, crucially, assert control over your emotions. Yeah, it's not easy, but it works. It also happens to be the only truly effective way of addressing panic porn on a wider scale. Just raise people more emotionally stable. We did that for a while, mind you, but then we decided to be revolutionaries, and instead of asking why some things are the way they are, we took them apart because they were inconvenient for some ephemeral political project. And I say we because, as a civilization, almost all countries did some of this. Sure, there are degrees and nuances, but the fundamentals don't differ that much. When we allowed feminism not only to exist but to thrive, we kicked the collective emotional stability of both men and women into the teeth. When we decided that dysfunctional families as a norm rather than an exception are a good thing, or at the very least not a terrible thing, when we decided that, we guaranteed that more emotionally unstable people will emerge. When we decided that touching grass is loitering, same thing. The tyranny of small decisions. The road back from that is not simple, and quite frankly, I'm not optimistic at all. Usually governments and authorities in general make all of the wrong decisions before even considering the correct decision. And there's still plenty more wrong decisions to be made. That's why the individual path is more likely to succeed. Because convincing yourself on how to examine the truth, or at the very least, how to examine if you're being whipped into a frenzy, is a whole lot easier than to convince the government to let go of its newly found toy of controlling the plebs. I mean, heck, the current discussion is still framed as if panic porn exists only on the far right or only on the far left. So not even the whole spectrum is even acknowledged, and that is by design. But that's okay. As I said, it works like an epidemic. Eventually, the illusion is shattered naturally. Then it's a bumpy experience, and then eventually everyone forgets. In the meantime, a new version of snake oil dooming appears. The cycle can't really be broken, though it could be managed better, that's for sure. And finally, number 7, some conclusions. Well, ultimately, the whole discussion boils down to this. If you ask the right questions and can evaluate the answers, you're already much better prepared to deal with snake oil dooming. Because in addition to avoiding being swept up in an emotional frenzy, there's also the issue that some messaging may look like panic porn, but may in fact be pointing out something real. I know people who just assume anything a bit more alarmed is panic porn. That works well in a stable world, but opens you up to plenty of vulnerabilities in an unstable one. Why? Who? Under what authority? How? With what logistics? These 4 questions, alongside the intentional avoidance for as long as possible of the question why, will weed out most of the manipulation without asking for any emotional commitment from you, thus guarding your mental health. Now, the part about avoiding the question why always strikes people as odd, but the reason is also simple. In addition to triggering a conspiratorial response, Carefully crafted panic porn is in fact very well prepared to answer why. It's called a second-level hook. If the baseline message doesn't scare you, the motivation for why you should think the baseline message is not only scary but true, that usually does the trick with even more people. Sure, not all people, not all of the time, but it doesn't have to be all people. You already know why. You can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all of the time. Ultimately, a message, be it panic porn or some other type of propaganda, doesn't need 100% adherence or even 90%. Panic porn is specifically designed to radicalize people, and as you're all aware, 10% radicalization can routinely be enough to overthrow a regime. For that, see my 2018 video, The 10% Rule, the most hardline wins. Mind you, this works in reverse as well. That's why I like the term snake oil dooming. Most well-known examples of panic porn aim to radicalize people into doing something, anything, based on a certain fear. But those examples are well known because they're easier to study. It's a lot harder to study panic porn aimed at making the target feel hopeless or overwhelmed. Not to mention that it comes with the challenge of making its audience sad. You see, successful snake oil dooming for the purpose of making one hopeless is genuinely loved by its audience. So good luck telling them that it's a lie and there's no reason for the doom and gloom, or at the very least that there are reasons for optimism. I know from experience, pulling people out from the doom and gloom vortex is really, really hard. But it's a lot easier not to fall into it. So yeah, gather wisdom, ask the right questions, and really take a chill pill. And whenever possible, observe things personally. It helps a lot, not just with avoiding believing in snake oil dooming, but with overall mental health too. And again, making this video is not in my interest. Maybe that's why I failed as an internet grifter, because I don't feel the need to opine on everything under the sun, and I make no attempt at making people afraid. But then again, someone has to be a little bit more jolly in this ocean of doom. Maybe? And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and please send me to Tajikistan, and in the process, join our community on members.freedomalternative.com. And with that said, I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.